Back in late 2025, something strange started happening. Reports from across the world all pointed to the same conclusion. Saudi Arabia had quietly slowed down or even stopped construction on one of the most ambitious megaprojects ever attempted, the line. Tens of billions of dollars had already been spent. Entire desert landscapes had been reshaped. Massive excavation zones stretched for kilometers, and thousands of people had been displaced to make way for a city that was supposed to redefine the future. And yet, suddenly, everything seemed to stall. No major updates, no visible acceleration, no clear direction. Which raises a critical question. Was this entire project, this 170-kilometer-long futuristic megacity, doomed from the very beginning? Because for years the line was presented as the next evolution of urban living. A city with no cars, no roads, a perfectly linear structure cutting through the desert, designed to house millions of people in a completely new way. But behind the cinematic trailers and polished 3D renders, a very different reality was unfolding. One that would eventually force even Saudi Arabia to confront a difficult truth. At its core, the line was never meant to be a normal city. It was designed as a 170-kilometer-long structure, stretching straight across the desert, just 200 meters wide, but rising up to 500 meters in height. A mirrored wall cutting through the landscape, housing entire communities inside a controlled, hyper-efficient environment. On paper it looked revolutionary, but in reality it was something else entirely. Because while the public saw stunning visuals and bold promises, insiders began noticing serious problems early on. According to reports, key decisions about the project were often made based on 3D renderings alone. Detailed engineering studies, feasibility analysis, and real-world constraints were sometimes pushed aside in favor of what simply looked impressive. And at the center of it all was Saudi Arabia's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. He played a major role in shaping the vision of the line. From its extreme scale to its unconventional design, many of the project's most ambitious elements came directly from his vision. But that created a dangerous gap. Because what works in a digital render doesn't always translate into something that can actually be built. And as construction began, that gap started to grow. Developers working on the project reportedly knew that major parts of the line were unrealistic, but the project kept moving forward anyway, at least for a while. Because even for a country with enormous financial power, there are limits, and the line was starting to push far beyond them. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund had already committed massive resources to NEOM and its surrounding infrastructure. But as construction progressed, costs didn't just rise, they began to spiral. Estimates for the full vision of NEOM started reaching into the trillions of dollars. And suddenly the question was no longer whether the project was ambitious, it was whether it was even financially possible. At the same time, another problem was quietly growing in the background. Foreign investors were losing confidence. One analyst described it bluntly. Investors were simply not buying into the Crown Prince's vision anymore. And that matters more than it sounds. Because projects of this scale don't just rely on national funding. They depend heavily on international capital, partnerships, and long-term financial trust. Without that, everything slows down. By 2024, the first real signs of trouble became impossible to ignore. Internal restructuring began inside NEOM, leadership changes followed, financial controls tightened, and the focus shifted away from grand visions toward projects that could actually be delivered. At the same time, several major architecture firms started pulling out. Names like Morphosis, Ajayi Associates, and HOK, companies that were once deeply involved, began distancing themselves from the project. Layoffs followed. More than 1,000 workers were reportedly let go as priorities shifted and uncertainty grew. And yet, despite all of this, construction had already gone too far to simply walk away. Because by that point, the desert had already been transformed. Because this wasn't just early-stage construction, this was massive, irreversible groundwork. Satellite images and drone footage revealed something striking. Large sections of land had already been excavated along the planned route. Entire zones had been prepared for what was supposed to become phase 1 of the line. Factories had been built, energy infrastructure was set up, entire worker communities were established in remote desert regions. They even launched what became one of the largest piling operations in the world, along with a massive dewatering system to prepare the ground for construction. In other words, this wasn't just planning anymore. This was commitment. Financially, the numbers were just as extreme. Reports suggest that around $50 billion had already been spent on the line and NEOM's core infrastructure. And that was before the actual vertical city had even begun to rise. But the real problem wasn't just money, it was scale. Because once you look beyond the headline numbers, you start to see how extreme this project really was. Take the mirrored exterior, for example. We've all seen the renders, a continuous reflective facade stretching across the desert, creating the illusion of a single, endless structure. But building something like that isn't simple. Even the Mariah Concert Hall, currently the largest mirrored building in the world, required extremely precise engineering. Thousands of glass panels had to be perfectly aligned, with small gaps in between to account for expansion in extreme desert temperatures. Now scale that up. The line would have required around 170 million square meters of mirrored glass. That's more than 17,000 times what was used for Mariah. At one point, the project was reportedly consuming around 20% of the world's entire steel production, and that was just for the foundation. At that rate, even global supply chains would start to break under the pressure. And that's the moment where the entire vision collided with reality. Because even with unlimited ambition, there are still limits. Saudi Arabia initially aimed to build the line in less than a decade, but the scale, the materials, and the logistics made that timeline unrealistic. By late 2025, it became clear. Construction, at least in its original form, was no longer moving forward. Updates slowed, communication faded, and the project quietly lost momentum. The line didn't collapse, it simply slowed down, because the gap between vision and reality became too large to ignore. And that shift reveals something bigger. This wasn't just a construction project, it was an attempt to redefine how cities are built. But in the end, it ran into the same limits every megaproject faces. Limits of cost, limits of scale, and limits of what can actually be built in the real world. For now, the line stands as a reminder, not just of ambition, but of how far reality can push back.